live now on Facebook and letting participants into the Zoom webinar. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Office Hours, moved back to Sunday morning. We are starting our study of the Book of Ruth this morning. My name is Chris Holmes, and I am the scholar in residence at First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta. And I'm co-hosting with two extraordinary Hebrew Bible scholars. We share some interesting Princeton Seminary connections. And so, Brennan, why don't you go ahead next and then introduce our guest host this morning?
Great. I'm Brennan Breed, Associate Professor of Old Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary, and I work at First Presbyterian Church Marietta as a theologian in residence. And I am so pleased to introduce our wonderful guest scholar today, Dr. Elaine James, who is Associate Professor of Old Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary, who works in biblical poetry and art in the ancient world. She works on issues of land, ecology, gender. She's all over the map in terms of interests and writing and publications. But she also has written a beautiful book that I absolutely love, which is called Landscapes of the Song of Songs for Oxford Press. She is just turning in a manuscript for a new book that will help people learn how to read biblical poetry, kind of a handbook to biblical poetry. So I'm looking forward to assigning that to students. And also has recently finished a co-edited book which introduces people to particular examples of how to read biblical poetry in a style of close reading. So kind of reading less like a technician and more like someone who is looking at a work of art. So she is pioneering several different avenues in biblical studies. But the thing that I really appreciate her being here for today was she's gonna help us think about the biblical narratives and poetry as art forms. So kind of Bible as literature is one way to think about this, but it's much more than at least I've encountered in terms of other forms of kind of Bible as literature, which is like, this is a plot. Elaine takes it a lot further than that, and we'll be excited to hear from her today. So Elaine, thank you so much for joining us. It is a real honor and pleasure to have you here. And thank you for taking your time to help out with office hours. And let me just start off by asking you, we have a typical question that we begin with, which is, if you are going to introduce us to at least a part of your hermeneutical lens or some of your assumptions about how to read Scripture, what would some of those be? If you're kind of introducing the Bible to people and you got to put a couple things on the table first, what are some of those things that help us to read Scripture?
Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm just delighted. And thank you for your kind introduction as well. So my theological presuppositions when I come to reading the Bible are, first of all, I would say that it's worthwhile. And that's not a given for a lot of contemporary readers, even for a lot of church readers, honestly. I encounter a lot of people who think, they love the tradition or they love being part of the Christian tradition, and yet they just don't think that there's much that's recoverable within, especially the Old Testament. And so the idea that it's worthwhile, that we might return to it and find it, as many readers have before us, a useful resource, as well as, I think, a source of what I would just use a really affective term, a source of delight. It's a place to go back to find ourselves formed. And that being said, I also think it's literature. And so that's also an assumption that I bring to the text. And when I say literature, I mean it's written mostly in narratives and poetry. In fact, way more poetry than we often give it credit for. So people tend to think of the Bible as didactic literature, as literature that you read and then you extract a kind of message or meaning that should teach you something. It's an instruction. But if we take the mode seriously, we get a lot of stories and we get a lot of poetry. And those two forms can certainly teach us things, but they are also inexhaustibly, I would say, complicated, complex. These are texts that are rich and layered and that repay coming back to again and again. So those are two sort of guiding assumptions that I have when I read biblical texts, that we might continue to pay close attention and closer attention yet to them as art forms, to think about how we might be shaped by them, not because they have an easily extractable moral all the time. In fact, lots of times they don't have an easily extractable moral. And so it causes us to come back to the text again and again, to be renewed by the questions themselves.
So a lot of people, when they read a poem or something, will say something like, well, yeah, sure, but what does it mean? Like, why is there all this extra stuff that I have to like work through to get to the meaning of the poem? Like, just give me the meaning, right? Or like a narrative, like, well, I mean, if like on the Book of Ruth, it just tells me that like I should be a nice person. Like, just tell me I should be a nice person. Let's get away with all. Why all this kind of frilly, extra stuff that I have to like take off to get to the truth, right? And one of the things I love about what you teach us about poetry is that the kind of extraneous stuff that we think kind of like is surrounding some sort of moral or truth or something that's like the real thing. In fact, like the work of art itself and the experience of the work of art are the thing in most cases, right? I mean, is there like when you teach introductory classes, is there like an example that you give, or is there? I mean, I remember like that Billy Collins poem that Anna Carter Florence will assign often at Columbia Seminary, where it's like people think that like, reading a poem is like extracting like a confession out of a witness or something like that,
Yeah, that's good. I mean, it's true. I feel like people are often irritated by poems and by poets. Like, why are they making it so hard when they could just tell me what they mean, right? So oftentimes students will talk about like, well, what the author's trying to say. But in fact, what the author is trying to say is exactly what the author has said, right? It's what the text emphatically is. So when you think about, for example, the Song of Songs, on sort of a simplistic level, you could say, well, this is a poem about love, right? But if this is the point, to just celebrate love, someone could just say, let's all celebrate love. And then we could all move on with our day. But what the poet has offered instead is like, oh, sorry, did I interrupt you there?
No, I was just saying, yeah, get a nice t-shirt. You don't need, chapters upon chapters. Just celebrate love. That's all.
There you go. That's all
you need.
That was cool. So, and there's truth to that, right? You wouldn't be wrong to say that that's a meaning of the Song of Songs. And yet what the poem does is to, I think one thing that the poem does, and a lot of artwork does, is to actually change our relationship to time, right? Because we're asked to do something that isn't easy and quick, right? We're asked to do something that takes time. And so when you spend reading 8 chapters of poetry in the Song of Songs about love and all kinds of sort of related dimensions of that, including love of landscape, as I've argued in my book. In fact, what you're asked to do is take a different stance toward your temporal experience, right? You have to slow down, and you aren't given a really straight pathway through something, but instead you're asked to experience something, right? So it's sort of a more circuitous, perhaps slower experience of the text, and slower experience, therefore, also of time. And the richness of that, and delighting in what the richness offers, what the richness of that experience of reading offers, is something that is, I think, fundamentally valuable.
Yeah, and in our own kind of day and age, the idea of like productivity, like you got to just make as much stuff as you can as quickly as you can, and also kind of like even theologically, like how often maybe subliminally, maybe sort of outright, the church will say, Christianity is mainly about knowing stuff, or having these like particular truths. But if it really the truth of our entire lives is something more like a relationship to our space, to the created world, to each other, to God, that's going to like require a different kind of sensibility, right? Than like just trying to kind of get as quickly as we can to like the truth that will fix something or whatever. I don't know. Yeah, that's what I really have loved, because I am someone who's guilty of that. Like when I was in seminary, I was like reading poems. I was like, geez, get to the point. Like I got work to do, what am I doing reading the Psalm? I mean, praise God in the heavens, praise God in the high. I mean, geez, just, but as I've gotten older, I mean, I really have, I've really appreciated this lesson that I think poetry more than other forms of art teaches us, which is that, the more we can slow down and kind of look at our own lives and really look carefully at our relationships and other people around us and the land around us, the more we can like slow down and actually kind of pay attention to to what exists or whatever. I don't know. It's kind of, it sounds mystical almost, but like that is much more kind of the truth of the world than any kind of summed up statement can make it. Anyway, that's why. So I've really, really appreciated your Song of Songs book for just like, taking something that I've usually been like, why is that in the Bible, or reduce it to like, it's just about love, but slowing it down, and there's so much, it's so rich, there's so many connections in there. But Ruth, I think we can think about that way too, right? I mean, instead of reducing it to this tale of like, faithfulness is great or something, but really, really paying attention to the details in the story, which kind of open it up for us in a way. But yeah, so like if on that topic about kind of narratives, like, can you tell us a bit about like Hebrew literary art, and I guess poetry or narrative, but like how does Hebrew poetry or narrative art work? Is it just kind of like our own narratives and poetry today, or are there things that are kind of distinctive about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the interesting things that scholars have noted about Hebrew narrative versus Hebrew poetry is the sort of different way that they represent reality. So in biblical Hebrew narrative, you often get a pretty spare accounting of stories. So you get really minimalistic details. We don't often hear, for example, about what characters look like or what they're thinking. We don't get a lot of narrative. We don't often get a narrator who tells us those kinds of details. Instead, there are a lot of gaps. We get sort of the crucial details, and then a lot that, to use a famous phrase from Eric Auerbach, right? These texts are fraught with background. It's all in the background. And so there's a lot that we have to reconstruct. And the famous example of this is Genesis 22, the binding of Isaac, right? Where what do we not know in that story? A lot, right? Yeah. Among the things we don't know is what is Abraham's interior experience? Like what do we, and so we fill in the gaps a lot, and we make meaning of the story in part through that experience of interacting with the text, of inquiring of it, of filling in details that we wish we could know. And so there's this sort of like opacity to biblical narrative that is really strategically used, I think, for developing the stories, but also for sort of tantalizing us into the stories, right? Thinking about how they might continue to mean. Hebrew poetry is really different from that. It too tends to be a pretty short form. But it's much more dense. So it's densely wrought, and we get a lot more sort of explorations of emotion and interiority in Hebrew poetry that are almost totally lacking in biblical narrative. And in fact, often you'll get in biblical narrative a poem inset at a moment that sort of helps us to see what's going on inside of a character's mind where we wouldn't see it otherwise.
Like a thought bubble or something.
Yeah, that's nice. It's like a thought bubble, except it's an extremely, usually sort of ornate thought bubble, right? Like it's not just like a flash of consciousness, although it is that. It also sort of is a pause in the story that draws us in a deeper and different way. And you see that actually here in the Book of Ruth, right? You don't get a lot about what Ruth and Naomi are experiencing, except we do get a couple of texts in chapter 1 where we do, right? Where we get Ruth's proclamation of loyalty to Naomi, which is given in these parallelistic couplets. And we get Naomi's sort of complaint, right? About her lot in life, about her name, that sort of shed a different insight on a story that otherwise doesn't give us a lot of that kind of interiority. There's other things that poetry does as well, right? It's a very, it's pretty dense in terms of its stylistics, right? It's mostly written in parallelistic lines. It tends to be pretty short, but but densely crafted, right? So you get like not a lot of words, but when you get them, they're like often playful sound play, word play. You get a lot of those kinds of features that you see in other bodies of poetry as well. So yeah, there's a lot in the Book of Ruth that sort of lends itself to thinking about how the literature is operating on a complex level. And you get, the story's set up in this cool way where you get these 4 tidy chapters, almost like 4 acts of a play. And you foreground in the first 3 chapters the experience of Naomi. And then chapters 2 and 3 are these pretty tightly organized plot lines where they start with Naomi and Ruth hatching a plan and then like setting it out, setting it into action and seeing what happens. And then you get the same thing in chapter 3, Ruth and Naomi hatching a plan and then like setting it into action and seeing what happens. So there's this like a lot of a sense of very crafted art to the whole thing. And I mean, in the literature too, I mean, in the narrative too, not just in the poetry, but in the narrative too, you get a lot of like wordplay. So they have to leave Bethlehem, which Hebrew Beit Lechem, right, is the house of bread, because there is a famine. There's no bread, there's no food, right? And the names in the Book of Ruth too sort of play with their various meanings. There's a lot of kind of cleverness, you might say, or craftedness to the book that repays kind of thinking about how do these things interact with each other and create a richer experience.
That is so cool. Yeah. And is there like a, and just for folks who don't know, that word parallelism that you used is like kind of a lot of introductions to Hebrew poetry begin and end there, which is sad because there's a lot more to do than parallelism. But just like, can you give us an example of what that means? It's kind of like the catchword for a lot of what people know about biblical poetry, but it's often kind of skipped over or glossed over a bit. So like, what is parallelism?
Yeah, parallelism is like something that's written, is a poem that's written in couplets, right, in 2 lines. So parallelism is, if you think about it just in the most general terms, it's a kind of repetition. And so you can see parallelism enacted at lots of different levels, parallelistic words that are repeated, parallelistic ideas, parallelistic couplets. You get all kinds of varieties of parallelism, but usually when it's used in biblical poetry, it's meant to say that in biblical poetry, you often get a line and then what feels like the same line again, but usually stated in slightly different words. And you could see it even, I just have my Bible here open to the Book of Ruth. You see it in the poem that Ruth uses, that Ruth speaks in verse 16. Look at the first lines of this. So this is Ruth 1:16. But Ruth said, and then our poem begins, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you." Okay? So right there you have a parallelistic couplet. Do not press me to leave you. So she says, don't make me leave you, right? And then what does she say? Or to turn back from following you, right? What she just said the same thing again, don't make me leave you. But it's sort of stated in different words. And that form, that sort of like 2-step, 1 step forward, but it's sort of a 2-step forward thing, happens throughout the poem. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. Your God shall be my God, right? You get this sort of like redoubled effect that it too, I think, is temporal. It changes our experience of time, right? Because you sort of get a statement of something, but if it were enough to just say it one time, we would say it one time and be done with it. And yet the art of biblical poetry tends to make us sort of sit, and it's maybe a function, I'm not sure about this, it may be a reflex of kind of an oral background of some of this poetry, but certainly it is a stylistic device that biblical Hebrew poetry prefers, which is to say something and then to say, and James Kugel says, it's like saying A and then what's more B, right? There's a little bit of a sense of, I'll add a little bit to this in the second line, but the overall effect is kind of like, again, slowing us down. We stay with an idea a little bit longer than we might if we were simply recounting it in everyday speech or even in prose.
Nice, yeah, thank you. That's great. And I asked you this earlier, and if that was a great example, we can stop there. But is there an example? I mean, maybe from the song or a psalm or something else? Can you just like give us a short, I don't know, like a test drive of a poem? Just help us to see a little bit of some of the kind of artistry of biblical poetry in action, or should we stop there with Ruth 1?
Well, there's a lot to choose from. That's a great question. So I think that where could we go to for this?
Apologies for my I was in the blind. All of a sudden the sun came blindingly into me, so I've been moving my curtain every day.
No worries at all. Well, I think that like if you go to if you think about like Exodus, right? In Exodus 15, ooh, nice. We get 2 poems. One is sort of this, usually called the Song of Moses in Exodus 15. And then we get the Song of Miriam in Exodus 15:21. So like the first 18 or 19, the first 18 verses are this poem that's attributed to Moses. And then we get a little snippet of a poem, the Song of Miriam. And you can see examples of parallelism here. You get a lot of interesting stuff here. I just want to call your attention, if you look at Exodus 15, verses 7 through 8, in the greatness of your majesty, you overthrew your adversaries, you sent out your fury, it consumed them like stubble. So this is, the narrative setting is, of course, is set like at the edge of the Red Sea, right after they've had this victory over Pharaoh's armies. And then we get this, at the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up, the floods stood up in a heap, the deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. This is pretty archaic language here. And so it's sort of, even in Hebrew, it's a little bit difficult, but you can see parallelism. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up, the floods stood up in a heap, the deeps congealed in the hearts of the sea, right? So you get this sort of threefold descriptive moment that celebrates, in these like profoundly mythological terms, this experience of the Exodus. And so this kind of like dwelling with the descriptive moment, you don't get that very much in the biblical narrative in general, but we have it here in the poem in a way that kind of offers us an opportunity to dwell with that image, which is like fantastic and terrible and strange and mythological, right? You know, you have this, I think this imagery is just so outsized, right? It makes you think in like massive terms.
That's
and
so
then
cool.
If you look ahead to the Song of Miriam, I'll just point this out. A lot of scholars think that this is actually the older version of the song that's been sort of taken up and some people might even say co-opted by the voice of Moses. Right. But we have here the prophet Miriam, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and with dancing. And Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea." So in this moment, I think you also get a little bit of a window into the excesses of Hebrew poetry, which are probably, a lot of these had some kind of setting, some kind of liturgical setting, and probably some kind of musical setting. So here Miriam is singing and also calling to her audience to sing as well. So there's a communal and probably like call and response dimension to this as a liturgical practice. And she's also taking up a musical instrument. And so one can imagine, as you are thinking about the experience of these poems, for us, we're often doing this, what I'm doing right now, right? Which is like me alone looking at my text and thinking about it, or maybe singing or reciting them in a liturgical context. But for the ancient poets, or for the ancient people, most of whom are not literate, the experience of poetry is very different from that, right? And so we have to think about the kinds of excesses of meaning that are possible in oral settings, as opposed to simply like the practices of private reading that we're so accustomed to in the West in the modern era.
Wow, that in itself is a little bit of a plug for the Handbook for Biblical Hebrew that will be coming out from Oxford Press, hopefully sometime next year, or in some time after that. But thank you so much for just helping us get a sense for poetry. It's such an undervalued art form, at least I think it is in our modern context. It seems like in the ancient world, this was like a primary form of entertainment, but also of theology. I mean, just thinking of how theology was done through poetry in the ancient world seems pretty cool. Chris, I've been talking a whole lot, and Elaine has been talking some like from New Testament, right? Yeah, what you got? Like,
I feel so very left out, in this conversation. I'm glad that you've given me a chance to say something. No, the thing that struck me, Elaine, as you were talking, was actually, have spent way too much time with this treatise called On the Sublime by Longinus, and he talks about the way in which literature can do the sort of stop the temporal dynamics, or he even uses the religious language of ecstasy. It takes you out of yourself, allows you to sort of stand outside of yourself and to witness something else. And so when you took us to the poetry of Exodus and the descriptive language, it is sort of an ecstatic moment that gets you outside of yourself for something other than just the didactic purpose. And our tendency to sort of want to find a single meaning or like what's the moral of the story rather than to experience it, also reminds me of another treatise from my period, right? Thousands of years after what we're talking about with Ruth. But Plutarch, the philosopher and writer Plutarch, has this really fun treatise called On How to Read Poetry. And he basically says, like, read it for moral formation and don't get so scared by all of these immoral things that the Greco-Roman gods are doing, and so he's really afraid. He wants to actually sort of put a fence around the tendency that literature could have to bring people outside of themselves. And, so he really wants to temper that reading process. And it's interesting to think of the role of the church in either encouraging us to read narratives as narratives or not. And your comments at the very beginning of our session about it's worthwhile studying this reminds me that, we have 4 gospels, and I get so frustrated as a New Testament scholar when students don't want to even acknowledge that there's 4 different stories about Jesus and that these are different. And if we just sort of, say, well, they all basically say the same thing, my response is why are we even reading scripture? Like, if you don't want to be delighted by it, if you don't want to be surprised by it, if you don't want to be troubled by it, if all the book of Acts is how this Jewish renewal movement moves from Jerusalem to the ends of the world, well, heck, that's a lot quicker than reading 28 chapters of narrative. But if you slow down and you sit with it and you come back to it again and again and again, I think that there is, this is the place where I would say, like, the Bible is profound in its meaning. There's a profundity to it that we come back to it, but we can't come back to it as a bumper sticker or a t-shirt. We come back to it as poetry and prose and narrative, trying to be transformed by it. But some of that transformation happens because it is narrative. And this, so I do see some connections, even though the narrative of the Gospels or of Acts is different. I do think that there's some similarities, and in particular, the role of speech. When Elaine, again, when you were talking about Ruth's poem in Ruth 1, this does give us some of the internal process. Maybe not, Ruth was really hungry and she wasn't confident about what she was going to say, but she said it anyways.
She was delirious. She didn't know what she was saying.
So we don't maybe get all of that, but it's, the sort of Greco-Roman theorists of history say, characters in histories, when they speak, they reveal what kind of character they are. So when Peter speaks in Acts or when Paul speaks in Acts, they have a revelatory function. They tell us something about these characters. And so I think we see that as well in Ruth.
I like what you were saying there. Actually, if I could just connect back to the idea of ecstasy, ecstasis, right? Being out of your place. It makes me think about a couple of things. The first is the Song of Songs, right? So I think that this function of trying to sort of put a kind of container around that experience is absolutely the case in the history of songs interpretation, right? So the opening line, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine, right? What is that if not sort of an ecstatic experience, right? It is absolutely not pointing us to any exterior meaning, right? But rather conveying this sort of experience that is profound, right? It's this profound erotic experience, which is sort of like, if you sit with that, can be sort of challenging. And so both the church and the synagogue were sort of concerned about this and wanted to really point to how this text also draws us into this like broader web of meaning. And so they sort of like leaned into that dimension of interpretation, especially to say this is a mystical meaning, and specifically a meaning that is allegorical, right? It is the sense of scripture that is deeper than what we see on the surface. And I think like that's a perfectly a perfectly legitimate way to approach the text, because it points us to this very real experience in literature, which is that the texts always are sort of looking and drawing in different directions and drawing us in different directions. And yet, in the case of the Song of Songs, I think that was sort of this sort of suspicion of human eroticism has within religious communities also sort of led to a reduction of meaning, right? It has to be only about God. It can't be about human love, instead of being able to have this broadening view that somehow our understandings of human love give us a window into the divine, and vice versa. God is the source of all love, right? This is a sort of twofold or multi-step kind of way of thinking about Scripture's excesses of meanings, as opposed to sort of trying to contain it.
That's so cool. And also, like, yeah, the experience of love is something that, like, you can feel, but also if you don't kind of sit back and, I don't know, like, process it or try to actually experience it, think about it as, you can kind of take it for granted and lose it in a way. I mean, it strikes me that, like, during this time of COVID, you hear over and over again people saying, hey, look, people think I would feel so much better if I knew the day this would end or something. And people are like, actually, that wouldn't necessarily help so much. What would help you is like a sense of mindfulness and presence right now in the midst of this, and I just see all this reinforcement, like in the newspapers, and, here's an app for mindfulness that'll actually help you during this time, and it strikes me that poetry is this invitation to, like, sit with ourselves, or sit, with our thoughts and our feelings, and process them in a way with kind of a guide, like trying to reflect on love and wine, and the flavors of wine, and the feeling that you get after a glass of wine, just kind of thinking about that and love and so on. 30 minutes with that a day would probably help me a whole lot, I would guess. But, the connection to the mystics too, and the idea of like a reflective prayer life, kind of a rich, deep interior life, that poetry is an invitation to have that. And that's something that, like, I at least I feel like our world kind of discourages us from having, just with the kind of forms of.
Well, the prominence of the lament tradition within the biblical poetry is a nice example of this, right? Like, you get these texts that are just filled with complaining and bemoaning and really articulating the depth of human despair. And that's something that's culturally not very, it's not like looked well on in our culture. We don't create a lot of spaces for that. And yet the prominence of it within the biblical tradition itself sort of suggests that this kind of living with and through grief requires this kind of both articulation, but also this sort of just patient presence. Your idea too about this, like, what does it mean to just sit with something? It just reminded me of something my 5-year-old has been saying a lot to me lately, which I say, I love you. You tell your kids you love them. And he says to me almost every time now, he says, Mom, you don't have to tell me that every day. Right? And he's sort of like, if the point of saying I love you, right, is simply to convey this kind of meaning, then why would you have to say it every day, right? I mean, it's like, it would be silliness. So my 5-year-old is sort of picking up on this, like, if the point is simply meaning, then why reiterate it? Why say it over and over again? Why say it in different ways? Why write 1,000 love poems about it, And yet there is this impulse in us that it seems to me is not identical to the conveyance of meaning, right? Even in that act of telling someone you love that you love them, is this kind of like necessity of the moment to say it again, or say it anew, or experience it oneself again, be reminded of it in perhaps richer and more broadening ways. So I think poetry is one thing that helps us do that. And the scripture of poetry models that for us, right? It's not enough to just say the thing, right? It's something about creating an experience, or living in a relationship, or like enriching our experience of the present moment, right? How do we expand our understanding of what we are going through at any given moment? Part of the way we do that is through these like artful reconfigurations and re-experiences that help us to see with new eyes.
Like Naomi, saying "Call me Mara" at the end of chapter 1-2, her poem that is a kind of reflection on her lament. And I've even heard people say, "Oh boy, she's just kind of complaining right here," But if we look at it that way, that this is an artful reimagining of her own life, and an honest interaction with her life, rather than trying to get over it or get past it or so on. To really give full voice to what she's feeling at that moment is itself theology. It is, her own pastoral care. It is, it is meaningful in and of itself without having to reduce to some kind of point or something. Yeah, that's so cool. And I mean, I don't know, there's like hardly a more timely thing. I don't know about you all, but everyone that I know has been freaking out about a lot of things lately, and reflecting on, gratefully for a lot of things too. Ruth Bader Ginsburg passing away suddenly. People have been reflecting on her life, her legacy, her meaning of her career, and so on. But also, there's a lot of nervousness in the world right now that this is adding to as well. But even, I even feel like people kind of jumped to the political kind of game, which is, politics is important and so on. I'm not one of those people who says we shouldn't talk about politics, but like, I feel like a lot of people jumped right over the whole, like, hey, let's like experience this person's life and reimagine it and think about it and try to put it into words as a way of gratefulness. And her dying also, right on the Jewish New Year, right on Yom Kippur. There's like traditions about the kind of the legends die right around Yom Kippur because God was kind of figuring out the calendar for next year about who's going to die, and God like lets the people live as long as they can until the New Year, and that's how you can tell the great kind of righteous people. There's all this cool stuff you could talk about with but that's just one kind of thing in the news right now that helped me think about that. But just like living our lives, I don't know, poetically, like it seems like something people used to do that, right? But like we don't, I don't know. I at least don't think that way. And I want to.
Yeah. So I think that this will eventually transition us into a discussion of some more of Ruth and some introductory matters. And I think it relates to Brennan, what you just said, but I'm interested, Elaine, in this concept of gap filling, the idea of filling in gaps in the narrative. And I think one of the consequences of the like quick get to the meaning is a reluctance to fill in those gaps, right? It's seen as like a sin to, if I can't find it in the text of Ruth, I can't do it. And yet there's a whole interpretive tradition that is much more playful and imaginative in filling in gaps. And I'm thinking of Jewish tradition, or I'm thinking of Dr. Will Gaffney's work with Womanist Midrash. And so I wonder if you have any advice about the limits maybe of gap filling, or how gap filling, if we attend to the ways in which we fill gaps, that can be a productive process, that can be a generative process. Because with Ruth, there's going to be a lot of places where we will fill in the gap, where we will fill in like, oh, Ruth must have done this because of this reason, or Naomi must have said this for this reason. And so I wonder if you have any sort of recommendations about gap filling and the playfulness maybe of doing so.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, I think that we are always doing some gap filling, whether we know it or not, right? And there are a lot of, and I think this is a good moment. And I think that my guess would be that we're in a moment of social awareness that is significant enough that people, I think, are beginning to think about, what are the assumptions that I take for granted? What are the assumptions I make? What are the things I take for granted? And that's, I think, always an important first step for an interpreter, right? Because people will interpret even the characters of Ruth and Naomi very differently based on a certain set of assumptions that they may or may not even be aware of. So if you look at their dynamic, even in chapter 1, right? Naomi says to both Orpah and Ruth, like, right, turn back from, I can't help you, go home, go back to your people. And Orpah, they both weep, and Orpah says, all right. And Ruth says, no. And then again, no. And then she gives this beautiful speech. And then the text says, when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. Right? So the text actually tells us very little about that interaction that's useful for thinking, for us, for thinking about exactly like what this dynamic is like. And you can imagine this in all kinds of different ways, right? So is Naomi irritated with Ruth, right? Is Ruth doing this out of an act of devotion, of faithfulness, or is this an act of desperation? What do we know about Ruth about Ruth's background? Nothing, right? We know nothing at all. And so what do we assume are her motivations for going back with her mother-in-law? So even in that dynamic right there, and I think a lot of sort of pretty pious, faithful interpretations of this book want to say Ruth is doing this out of devotion, right? Devotion to loyalty and loyalty to her mother-in-law. That is a model of faithfulness. And again, and faithfulness does get talked about in this book. And so that's one very viable interpretation. But if you're bringing a set of assumptions that suggests that Ruth has other options and that she's motivated by care for Naomi, then that's absolutely viable. But another interpretation is also, other interpretations are also possible, right? I mean, the setting is a setting of essentially like ecological disaster, right? This is a famine, and it's driven Naomi away into Moab, right? And all we know about Ruth is that she married Naomi's daughter, but we don't know like why she's so resistant to going back home. We don't know like what her options are or what her, financial viability is, right? We're within a kinship-based family structure where that's the economic structure. And so the question of the future for each of these women is very uncertain, but they're at least Ruth's background is very much unknown. So our assumptions, I think the sort of imaginative midrashic, like seeing where the gaps are and beginning to speculate or beginning to draw out from ourselves what we think might be going on in this text and why, I think is like a really helpful way of not only examining ourselves, but also like bringing new questions to bear on the text. And yet at the same time, we also have to be very aware of what those assumptions are, because if we're not, there's always a risk, of course, of projecting ourselves onto the text or into the text. It's not always a bad thing, and it can be very much an opening. I think this is one thing that the sort of reticence of biblical stories do, is to draw us into them. So that's productive. And yet we have to sort of balance that. This is a circuitous way of saying we have to balance that also with some like self-scrutiny about what our assumptions are. What is it that we're bringing to the text?
Yeah, and it seems even the possibility of a text like this, if we're reading with our whole selves, if we're bringing that a text like this should open us up into an exploration of when have we felt ecological desolation, when have we felt untimely death, when have we felt a sense of abandonment by God. Like again, I think not to say that our story is then Ruth's story or is Naomi's story, but that seems to be something that a text like this invites us to do. It welcomes us to read with our full selves, to say, I wonder what it would have been like to be in this, this kind of context, in this cultural moment, facing these sorts of challenges. What would I have made? What kind of decisions would I have made? And again, doing so with self-scrutiny and with some care, but another way to get sort of into the text and out of our moment, one way of lingering with the text, I guess.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
One of the aspects of Ruth that might be helpful when we kind of set the table, and Elaine, you already pointed this out in a way, but just to make it more explicit might be helpful, but the kind of genre of Ruth. I mean, one of the things about literature studies, which can be helpful for us, or sometimes people can get really into the details of this and it can become unhelpful, but is the study of genre. And in biblical studies, we call this form criticism sometimes, but when you talk about it in terms of literature, it can be really helpful to say, like, what kind of literature am I reading? So like when you read Genesis 1, is this a science textbook? No, it's an ancient liturgy probably, or kind of poem, or poetic narrative about the origins of the cosmos from this ancient cosmological perspective. Taking that in mind helps us to kind of avoid, unhelpful, unproductive questions, or questions that kind of get us off the track of the text, like what were the quarks and neutrinos in Genesis 1. But so what genre of literature will we be looking at when we look at Ruth? And like, how do we read this? Like, what is it? What type of literature is this? And how do we engage it well?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, its setting is, it's short for one thing, right? 4 chapters. So that's a clue as to what kind of text it is. And it also, in its first lines, it sort of announces what kind of story it is. In the days when the judges judged, right? There's this kind of like once upon a time almost quality of the opening of this story. And both of these things point us to the possibility that, and because it unfolds as a narrative, and like, as we've suggested already, sort of an artfully constructed one, a lot of scholars have said this is some kind of short story, right? It's a probably, maybe it has some origins in folklore, maybe it's a traditional tale, but the way that it's constructed is it's constructed as a story, a short story. And so it sort of draws us into a fictive moment, a fictive world. And when I say fictive, I don't mean fictive as in fact versus fiction, but merely to say, I don't think the story is so much interested in telling us a history per se, as in drawing us into the drama of these 2 women's experience. And so in that sense, in the Jewish ordering of the canon, this is classed with the Ketuvim, right? The writings that are at the end of the book, where we also find, for example, the story of Esther, which shares some commonalities with the Book of Ruth in its kind of fictive dimensions. We might think about Jonah too as one of the biblical texts that also has some of these characteristics. It too is a short book that is doesn't seem to be so much interested in recounting a history as in telling a really good story, and a story that draws us in and is put to very interesting purposes as well. So that's some of how I would describe. I think that's kind of a useful way of thinking about it, right? How we encounter the story of Ruth is sort of the terms on which we might encounter any short story that we read, right? As we think about and are drawn into the rich experience of these 2 pretty marginal women, sort of teetering at the brink of survival.
Wow. And I liked how you earlier also said it kind of there's like some tight connections between, like, there's some foreshadowing in the beginning and end, like it kind of, there's a pattern to it and so on. So if we read with that in mind, it might help us see some things that are evocative and productive too. That's great. But you mentioned women. This is a biblical text that is a bit unusual in compared to much of the canon, because it focuses on the lives of 2 marginal women. And what do you make of that? Why is the Book of Ruth? I mean, I when I teach biblical Hebrew, I often use the Book of Ruth, and we translate a lot of it. This semester we'll get through 3, I think, chapters, but in part because there's a lot of verbs that are feminine verbs. It's one of the few consistent examples of this. I don't know if it exactly passes what they call the Bechdel test, 2 women talking to each other and not about a man. There's an argument about that. But what does it mean to have this story about 2 marginal women?
Yeah. Well, it's pretty awesome. I think that there have been a lot of feminist interpreters who said this is a pretty big deal and we should pay attention to it, right? It's not only a story about 2 marginal women, which is exceptional among the biblical texts, which are pretty androcentric. They're pretty male-centered on the whole. But it also is a book that really features, in an interesting way, the actions of women as well, right? They're not just sort of pawns in a larger plot, as women often are in biblical narratives, actually. But rather they are, they're agents, right? So the actions that happen are not actions of divine fiat, right? You don't see the deity intervening in really profound and parting the waters of the Red Sea sort of ways in this book. Instead, what you see is a lot of evocations of the name of God, right? So they're always blessing each other in the name of God and greeting each other in the name of the Lord. But there's a sense in which the deity's actions are sort of limited to, are sort of behind the scenes, right? Limited to, right, the harvest. God is seen as the one who gives grain, and also the acts of conception, right, which are parallel from the beginning to the end, right? The book starts with barrenness, both of the land and of the women who don't have progeny. They aren't able to conceive. The story ends with the return of fertility of both the fields and also the women, right? And these are seen as sort of the divine acts. But what you get in the middle is the story of these 2 women, right, making their way in the world. And that's this a pretty profound counter story to a lot of what we see in biblical narratives. If you think about, for example, the famine, which generates the plot, it sort of like kicks us off. This is the same thing that starts the Abraham stories, right? And the Isaac cycle as well. It's the same language. There was a famine in the land. And so then the question is, what are we going to do? And if the ancestral narratives tend to focus on male figures, here the story of Ruth centers on two women. And so women readers have been quite drawn to this text, of course, for those good reasons, right? It offers sort of an alternative view, and also foregrounds the way in which human action is also like linked up with this idea of divine blessing or divine plan, right? It doesn't all work out if you don't have these women working together to make it work. And so there's a sense of sort of divine blessing that permeates that, even those very human actions that are right central to the action of the Book of Ruth.
That's and lest people think that like this is some sort of modern concern and ancient people wouldn't have realized this or understood it. Chris, you might be able to help us here, but Ruth shows up in a surprising way in the New Testament, in a way that is even unexpected, right? I mean, can you fill us in a bit on that? Because I am not an expert on that.
Yeah, I hope that you're talking about the genealogy in Matthew.
That's what I was thinking about, yeah. I mean, I may be wrong here. I'm an Old Testament person, sorry. Yeah.
That's about the only thing I had in my pocket. So yeah. I'm glad that I can answer the question. And we see it at the end of Ruth. I had the pleasure this morning of sitting and reading Ruth through in one sitting, like you suggested we do, Brennan, and that Ruth is in the genealogy of David, and is therefore Jesus is in the genealogy of Ruth. And Ruth is one of the I think 2 or 3 different women mentioned in the genealogy in Matthew's gospel that sort of come from questionable, sort of backgrounds. In this case, this is a Moabite. This is a non-Israelite woman. And as other parts in the Hebrew Bible make clear, these were dangerous people or outsiders, or certainly not, people that you bring home to mom at Thanksgiving. And so that the Gospel of Matthew sort of lifts that up as a significant figure in a female figure in the genealogy of Matthew's gospel, says something both about Jesus as well as the gospel's perspective of Mary, who sort of has an unexpected or abnormal pregnancy by all accounts. And so, which
freaks Joseph out in Matthew too, right?
It does freak out Joseph. And so it, it's an interesting set of texts that we trace this line. Of course, Luke's gospel has a totally different genealogy that goes in a different direction. But for the time being, we can just sit with Matthew's that makes this connection to Ruth, and says something then both about Jesus and about Mary, I think, in significant ways.
So you mentioned something about Moabite women there. I wonder if we want to mention this as a way of setting the scene for Ruth. We don't know when Ruth was written exactly. There are some Aramaic words in there which may suggest that it's, or Aramaish words, which may suggest that it has kind of a late date. Of course, the story of Ruth might have been around a lot earlier. Some folks have argued that it's written before the exile. Some folks say after. So we don't know, and it kind of doesn't matter, right? The story is what the story is, but it does connect in certain really interesting ways to other traditions about women, which also kind of underscore the idea of Ruth being a marginal woman, and the story focusing on Ruth that is so unique and perhaps strange within the canon. But what if I was to say Moabite women, what does that phrase mean biblically?
Well, not good things, as you allude to. So there are a few instances, right, in the biblical text, and Moabites are they're sort of like you're sort of like the nasty neighbors, There are the stories about their ignominious backgrounds. Genesis 19, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. The aftermath of that is Lot and his daughters are seeking refuge, and Lot's daughters get their father pregnant, and so that they can bear children, right, so that they won't be effaced from the face of the earth, right? And the story goes that this is where the Moabites and the Ammonites come from, right? So this is very sort of shaming narrative around the actions of, particularly, it's particularly associated with Moab, but remember too, like these are very close neighbors. The Moabites are like right next door, just in the Transjordan. And in fact, like the fact that there's a close relationship among the two peoples is suggested by all of these stories, that even the story of Lot and his daughters, right, which is that, oh, there is actually some kind of relationship here between us and them. And so there's kind of one sees in the biblical materials an attempt to kind of distinguish, right, us versus them. We're not really, I know we're like them, but we're not really like them, right? There's kind of this resistance there within the texts. But notice that when there's a famine in Bethlehem, where does Naomi go? She goes to Moab, right? She hikes across the river and into what is a more agriculturally productive region, right? The plains of Moab are actually quite famous for being more reliably arable than the highlands region, mm-hmm. where Naomi is. Anyway, so there are these, and you have like other traditions as well. In Numbers 25, we get this proscription against Moabites ever entering the assembly, right? And then in Deuteronomy 23 as well, or Numbers 25, we have the no intermixing with Israel, right? Because with Moabites, I'm sorry. Yeah. In Numbers 25, we have the example of the proscription against intermixing, right? Because the intermixing with Moabites leads to the worship of foreign gods,
especially the women, right? Stay away from the women.
It's the mixing with Moabite women, right? So this like the women are sort of like, I don't know what, like tempting people to go astray religiously, and the sexual promiscuity or sexual relationship is sort of an emblem of that sort of like religious error as well. And then in Deuteronomy
current story,
we have this like no Moabites or Ammonites will be admitted to the assembly. So you have, on the whole, the witness about Moabites and particularly Moabite women is like kind of, it's like, don't be like that, right? This is sort of like a counterexample. And yet you have this text that says, hey, lest we think that we can uphold any idea of ethnic purity, right? David himself is from the line of a Moabite woman, and Ruth is sort of becomes the hero of this story, and she's a Moabite woman. And so Ruth serves as this pretty profound countertext to these other texts in the Bible that help us perhaps challenge some of these fear-based texts about intermixing and intermarriage. And you alluded to the setting of the Book of Ruth, or the potentially the date of the Book of Ruth. And if you think that it's a late text, as many people do, Persian period or something like that, then you can think about it in relationship to, for example, the book of Ezra. And in Ezra and Nehemiah, you have a lot of fear about intermixing, and particularly intermarriage with foreign women, right? Which become very threatening to a threatened nation that seems like it might be on the brink of annihilation, right? So you don't want to lose the sense of identity and cultural continuity. And so intermarriage is a very threatening sort of arrangement. And so if this text, and this is hypothetical, if this text is occurring at about the same time as that text, then we have to think about those two things in tension, right? You have, on the one hand, some strains of tradition that are quite fearful of Moabites in particular, but then you have a text like Ruth that speaks really powerfully to what it means to welcome the other into one's midst. In fact, to recognize that you yourself are the other, right? If there's anything that genealogy at the end of the Book of Ruth does, it's to make that exact move, right? To say, actually, Ruth the Moabite from the fields of Moab, which the story of Ruth calls her, and people call her over and over again. She's not just Ruth, she's Ruth the Moabite. In fact, she's often Ruth the Moabite from the fields of Moab, lest we forget.
Yes.
The text really makes us like see that and hold on to it. And yet at the same time, we can't just say she is other, because in fact she is, if we're positioned as Israelites, she is us, right? She's the ancestress of David, who's the most Israelite of all the Israelite kings. And so there's a lot of sort of complicating that this text helps us to do in that sense.
And before we run out of time, there's one other thing I want to ask you about, and that's the land that you just mentioned, from the fields and the land and so on. And your book on Song of Songs does such a great job thinking about geography and land and space. But in Ruth, you mentioned a couple of times kind of the agricultural dimension, or the land kind of ecological dimension. Is there something you want to kind of point out about that dimension of the story for us?
Yeah, well, I think it's one thing. So we talked earlier about assumptions that people bring to the text. And for many of us who don't come from agricultural backgrounds, right, we don't live in sort of like agrarian settlements in the Iron Age or the Persian period or whenever we think this might be, we might not be keyed in so much to these dimensions. But in fact, if you sort of start attending to the theme of land in the book, you'll notice that the story opens with a crisis of land, right? A famine in Bethlehem. And it is consistently concerned with the fields. And so you get over and over again a conversation about, or attention to the details of what's happening in the fields. And I think there's a sense of kind of reciprocity there. If the story opens with this question of whether the fields will be able to provide for the people, the story in fact takes us through then a sort of agricultural cycle where they come back to Bethlehem at the time of the barley harvest, and then the sort of significant scenes that happen both in the fields and then at the threshing floor, right? These are agricultural, specific agricultural settings. And Ruth sort of eventually being welcomed into the community happens as she's invited ultimately to eat, right? To eat with the other workers in the field, to work in the field first, to eat with other workers in the field, and then to be given grain by Boaz, a great amount of grain at the threshing floor, which is sort of symbolic of the return of fertility that we're seeing building up towards at the end of the story. But the story then ends, interestingly, with, as I mentioned earlier, this like confluence of fertility, right, between the fertility, agricultural fertility, and then finally the resolution, the fertility of Ruth herself as she conceives and gives birth to a son. And it's significant to me, to my eye, in light of all of these themes of land, that the women of the town give the son the name Obed, right? And Obed is a word that means to serve, right? But it can also mean to work. And so if you think back to Genesis, Cain is a tiller, an Obed of the land. And in fact, in the command in Genesis, the command for human beings is to keep the earth and to use the same language, right? Avad, we are to till it, to serve it, right? And so there's this sense that like when the story begins, which is with the problem of whether the land can provide, it ends with this odd promise that the people will then provide for the land. And in the mix, you get this funny detail that like Naomi herself is in possession of a little parcel of land that also has to be redeemed. I think that there's the question of access to land, and not only access to land, but access to fertile, arable land is a key dimension of this story. And I think in our current just desperate climatological era of disaster, this issue, I think, should speak to our hearts in a certain way, right? Where the ability of people to eat is like fundamental, obviously, to our human existence, our human survival, our ability to thrive. It connects us to one another, and it also requires some connection to land. And we don't tend to think and talk in those terms until we're in the most dire of circumstances where those things are taken away. So if you think about California, or the whole West, in fact, right now, particularly California and Oregon, and the way they've just been rent by these horrible wildfires, you think about the dislocation of people from the possibility of a future. It's a profoundly ecological reality, right? And I think the Book of Ruth is very sensitive to that. And you can think about that in a lot of different contexts, right? Because we also have Ruth's status as an immigrant to take into consideration. And the text seems to think that the way that this economic and ecological reality is resolved is through community, through the actions of communities to welcome and support and sustain one another in mutually caring ways, right? So the story is about Ruth, but it's also very much the story about Naomi. Each chapter starts with the plight of Naomi. And in the end, it's Naomi who is the one who actually has the child, in a sense, right? Like she's in your lap, yeah. That is called Naomi's child, right? A son is born to Naomi, which is fascinating. And so it's through these, I think, community-based and land-based practices that the tensions in the story ultimately become resolved. And to me, that is a profound, like, paradigm for how we think about the work that communities are doing, the work that the church is doing, to heal these breaches, ecologically, to offer access economically, to care for those who are marginal, and also to have this sense of reciprocal care, that our very future depends on the way that we care as communities for our own landscapes, for the lands that we belong in. And so there's a profound ecological dimension to this economic and community plot as well.
That is
That's
super
so
rich.
much, so much. I mean, I feel like
so great.
It just like opens up Ruth. I read it this morning, and now I feel like I didn't see anything. So, thank you.
That's the great thing about a literary scholar. Yeah.
And just see how many times the word field occurs. Just think, it's amazing.
Yeah. No, that's great. Well, we are at our time. We're actually, Elaine, we owe you 5 minutes of your time.
Sorry, Elaine. Yeah. Thanks.
You can send us a bill. But thank you so much for sharing so much with us about literature and about poetry and about narrative, and then about setting us up for a great study, chapter by chapter, of the Book of Ruth. So we are continuing on next week at 9:30 a.m. Facebook Live or Zoom, and we are looking forward to having another one of Brennan's colleagues from Columbia Theological Seminary. Brennan, who's coming with us next week?
Kathleen O'Connor, a wonderful biblical scholar and an excellent person, and someone who, again, like Elaine, is very interested in literature and the experience of poetry, in literary art forms and so on, and someone who really likes short stories. So tune in next week for Kathleen O'Connor. And Elaine, thank you so much for your time and your expertise, and I look forward to seeing everyone else next week. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks so much. What a pleasure.